By 1800, the East India Company controlled nearly half of global trade and commanded a private army rivaling the sovereign forces of Europe. Yet over the next 3 decades, the British Parliament would pass a series of laws that ended this corporation's legal right to conduct trade. Instead of dissolving, the company transitioned into the administrative proxy of the British Crown, governing the Indian subcontinent through a centralized political structure. These laws formed the initial constitutional framework for the British Indian state. This structural shift was a direct response to the economic and territorial shifts occurring thousands of miles away in Europe. By tracking the specific provisions of the Charter Acts of 1813 and 1833, we can see exactly how the British government repurposed a commercial entity into a sovereign one. To understand a modern Indian administrative state, we must first look at how the company's commercial rights were liquidated to serve the British government. The process of dismantling the company's trade rights began with the conflict between Britain and France in 1806. This map shows the extent of Napoleon's control over the European mainland. To weaken his rival, he implemented the continental system, prohibiting French allied territories from trading with the United Kingdom, closing European ports to British goods. This closure left British manufacturers with surplus inventory and no domestic or European outlets, leading to an immediate drop in exports. These merchants pressured the British Parliament for a solution, arguing that the domestic economy would stagnate because new markets were not opened. Their specific target was the East India Company's monopoly. They argued that independent British merchants needed access to Indian and Asian markets to replace the trade lost in Europe. In response to this lobby, Parliament drafted the Charter Act of 1813. The first significant reduction in the company's commercial power was not a social reform, but an economic measure to preserve British industry during the Napoleonic Wars. The 1813 Act formally broke the company's general trade monopoly, opening the Indian market to other British firms for the first time. However, the company retained 2 specific commercial assets: the exclusive right to trade tea and the monopoly on all trade with China for another 20 years. The act also allowed Christian missionaries to enter India, marking a formal shift in the region's cultural and administrative landscape. Beyond the religious context, the presence of these institutions encouraged the adoption of Western habits and dress. For the British, this was a way to align the local population with the consumption of imported British textiles and manufactured goods. A second provision established an annual fund of 1 lakh rupees for the education of the local population. Expanding trade required a massive administrative workforce. Transporting clerks from London was cost-prohibitive. By funding English language education, the British trained local administrators at a lower cost, who in turn became primary consumers for British goods. To manage this increasingly complex market, Parliament mandated that all laws passed by provincial governors in India now required explicit parliamentary approval. The 1813 Act utilized educational and social shifts to lower administrative costs and secure a wider market for British exports. By 1833, the 20-year extensions on the company's remaining monopolies were set to expire. The 1833 Act removed the company's final trade rights over tea and China. The East India Company ceased to be a commercial entity, its sole remaining function serving as a political agency for the Crown. To govern the vast territories acquired by the company, the British government needed to consolidate authority over the independent presidencies of Bengal, Madras, and Bombay. The 1833 Act created the Governor-General of India, with William Bentinck holding the title. This marked the completion of the centralization process. Power was no longer distributed, it was concentrated in a single central hub. The governors of Madras and Bombay were stripped of their legislative powers. From this point forward, all laws for the subcontinent would be drafted by the Governor-General's Council. Reflecting this loss of authority, the advisory councils for these local governors were reduced to only 2 members. By concentrating all legislative authority into one office, Parliament established the centralized structure necessary to govern India as a single political unit. With the Governor-General now responsible for the laws of all of India, his council required specialized legal training to draft consistent legislation. Parliament added a fourth temporary member to the council, known as the Law Member, a post first held by Lord Macaulay. This role was limited. The Law Member could advise on and draft legislation, but he had no vote on the council, a position similar to a modern Attorney General. This centralization also changed the legal terminology. Since these orders were now binding across the entire subcontinent, they were no longer called regulations, but were formally classified as acts. The 1833 Act also attempted to introduce open competitive exams for the civil service to replace the company's system of internal appointments. The company's court of directors blocked this provision, refusing to yield their power over personnel and hiring. Even as the Crown centralized political control, the company's internal directors fought to retain their influence over the workforce. In 20 years, the East India Company's trade rights were ended, and its commercial structure was replaced by an administrative one. This change was driven by the trade wars in Europe and the resulting economic needs of British industry. The company was no longer a merchant syndicate. It had become the political proxy for the British Parliament. The 1833 Act established the centralized, top-down legislative model that would characterize the British administration of India for the following century. The economic crisis of 1813 provided the impetus for the creation of the administrative machinery that allowed Britain to govern India from a central authority.